the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Well, greetings and welcome, everyone. The New York Post has a piece entitled, NATO Chief Predicts How China Could Set Off World War III. Let's not be naive about this. World War III will erupt when Chinese President Xi Jinping invades Taiwan and tasks Russian leader and ally Vladimir Putin to attack NATO nations to keep them out of the Pacific, the defense bloc's chief warned. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said it would be, quote, naive, end quote, to believe that Xi's ambition to conquer the autonomous nation of Taiwan would only involve the two countries, predicting that the war would be fought on two fronts. Folks, that's very dangerous, irresponsible, and inflammatory rhetoric for a NATO Secretary General to assert when he has presented absolutely no evidence to support the speculation. Why is he doing this? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. You know, with each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. So let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. The Washington Post reports the Trump administration moves away from abolishing FEMA. For months, Trump and his Homeland Security Secretary, you know her, the woman who's responsible for Homeland Security, but can't keep track of her own purse in a restaurant. Anyway, said that the Federal Emergency Management Agency could be eliminated. But as the president is now in Texas to view the impact of last week's deadly floods, administration officials say abolishing the agency outright is not on the agenda. With that said, folks, here's a question. Who is the director of FEMA? Here's the answer. FEMA does not have a director. FEMA has an acting administrator, David Richardson. And Richardson has been conspicuously absent during the federal response to the floods in Texas. Where is he? If you all can find him, let me know. Protesters and agents clash at major immigration raid at a California farm. Federal officers clashed with protesters during an immigration raid at a cannabis farm in Southern California, firing crowd control munitions, including tear gas. Meanwhile, a lawmaker has accused agents of showing disproportionate displays of force and preventing him from conducting oversight at a second farm. And I think we have to ask ourselves with this, how much of this conflict is actually contrived by the Trump administration? They really like these optics. That's my opinion. Finally, the Wall Street Journal has an incredibly interesting piece. The rapid rise of killings by police in rural America is the title. Last year, 1,260 people were killed by law enforcement, the highest level since data crunching organizations began keeping track of these statistics a decade ago. A major factor driving the upward trend is surprising. Sheriff's departments that generally patrol rural slices of America are killing more civilians. Sheriff's departments, which generally have the jurisdiction over counties, were involved in about a third of the police killings in 2024, despite making up just a quarter of law enforcement nationwide. This is according to the nonprofit Mapping Police Violence organization. Killings by sheriffs rose 43% from 2013, while that number rose 3% for police departments, which generally patrol cities and towns. With all of that being said, let's now turn to today's episode. The issue before us is, how reckless and irresponsible is it for NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to publicly assert World War III will erupt when Chinese President Xi Jinping invades Taiwan and tasks Russian leader and ally Vladimir Putin to attack NATO nations to keep them out of the Pacific? Why would he say this? What is this based on? Where is the evidence? My guest is a man who needs no introduction on this program. He's a teacher, an activist, a writer, and an analyst. KJ No, my brother, as always, welcome back. Let's see where we are here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
There we go. Thank you again, KJ. Really appreciate you joining me today. And so, well, okay, before I get to that, just overall, let me start with your thoughts on this, KJ.
Well, what's happening right now is there is a slight divergence of sequencing and opinion. The Trump administration, in particular, Secretary Hegseth, has signaled strongly to the Europeans that the United States wants a clear division of labor. They want to go after China. Remember, this is a three-course meal that they've set themselves up for. The main dish is China. Mm-hmm. They were going to knock out Russia as a simple appetizer, just polish it off. And then they were going to pivot to China. And then they were going to finish off Iran as a dessert. I mean, this is the kind of three-pronged, three-course meal that the imperialists had set up for themselves. Well, the problem was that Russia, the first appetizer, it was supposed to be a cakewalk, right? Mm-hmm. Didn't turn out that way. It turned out, gas station with nukes turned out to be something more formidable than just a gas station. And so they're caught in that quagmire, and the Trump administration, because they hate losing anything, they want to disengage themselves rapidly and have a division of labor where the Europeans continue to grind down Russia while the U.S. pivots rapidly to Asia, which is also now being thwarted by what's happening in West Asia, in the Middle East. So they're stuck in yet another quagmire. But what's happening is that the strategic sequencing and the division labor is not going well for them. And inside this context, Secretary General Rutte of NATO is having separation anxiety. He doesn't want Daddy to leave, saying, Daddy, you can't leave us now. We still need you. And you have to understand that this is just one big battle. You want to slice and dice this, slice, dice, and sequence this war. And I'm telling you, Daddy, that you still have to stay with us, because when China, quote unquote, attacks Taiwan, an absurdity on its face, they will send a message. President Xi Jinping will, and I'm quoting directly, if Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, that's bad grammar, he would first make sure that he makes a call to his very junior partner in all of this, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, residing in Moscow and telling him, hey, I'm going to do this. I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory. And I think the best response to this is Medvedev, who said that Secretary General Rutte needs to lay off the magic mushrooms. He needs to stop doing hallucinogens. So, I mean, essentially what he's doing, he's exposing his separation anxiety in public, which I think is a terrible and humiliating thing for a public official to do. He's trying to build the case that this is a single war, and it is. He's not wrong on that. It's a single war. The US sees it as a single unified field. It's just different courses in this, meal of violence that they've set up. And he's trying to cling on to Donald Trump's apron strings or pant leg as the U.S. continues to escalate to war.
You use the term "build a case," and I, in my mind, framed it as preparing public opinion, and I put it that way because when I read this story, it reminded me of early December of 1989 during the presidency of H.W. Bush. And there had been early in December, there had been talk about Panamanian President Noriega. And I remember watching the news one evening, and HW was being interviewed, and a reporter asked him, Mr. President, is the U.S. going to invade Panama? And Bush said, no, the American people aren't ready for that. And then right after he said that, the very next day, Daddy Bush, not his son Shrub, but Daddy Bush said, after he said that, we started seeing all of these anti-Panama, anti-Noriega stories in major U.S. papers and news shows. And then within about 10 days of his having said that, the U.S. invaded Panama. And so to me, Rutte's irresponsible, these public assertions, they seem to be taking us down a very similar perilous path. Your thoughts, sir?
You're absolutely correct. Yes. So this is part of the ongoing and continued manufacture of consent for war.
It's the setup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's complete setup. It's this constant spewing of propaganda, of threat mongering. And when they say China is a threat, what they really mean is that China is uppity because it won't stay in its place as a subordinate to the global imperium. And so, when he makes these accusations, he's actually making a confession. What he's really saying is that the US is preparing for war against China. NATO has been set up to be part of that coalition of the quote unquote willing. In fact, they're, constantly doing exercises, including, the recent German plane that buzzed a Chinese ship in the Red Sea and then had to turn tail because they realized they were, as the Germans would say, tief in der Scheiße, deep in the muddy, as we might say. So the constant threat mongering is part of a preparation or a manufacturing consent for war. I think I also sent you some information that the U.S. has just recently started the most intense war games since the Cold War.
But before we get there, and thank you for sending. Yes, I just want to make one more point about Rutte's comments. When he says, let me see if I can just quickly get there. When he says, it would be naive to he says it will be naive to think otherwise. That's, to me, that's very Trumpian, because Trump loves to say, well, everybody knows. whenever he wants to make an assertion that he can't validate and support with evidence, he says, well, everybody knows that it's true. And when in fact we know that it's fiction. And then he makes these speculative statements as though they are valid assertions. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, he would first make sure he makes his call to his very junior partner, trying to slight Putin in the process. I mean, and again, offering zero evidence to support these baseless, irresponsible, jingoistic accusations.
You're absolutely right. Yes, completely baseless, hypothetical, and he's misusing the second conditional. He needs to brush up on his grammar. But when he says that, I mean, he says that China wants to open up a second front when it, quote unquote, would attack Taiwan. What he's really saying is that, the U.S. plans to use Taiwan as a trigger to attack China. This is what's in the works right now. We see it with the information warfare. We see it with the staging of the theater, the logistical preparation of the theater all across the first island chain and the second island chain, even including the third island chain. These plans for war are incredibly advanced. And then you see it with the constant provocation. They're driving into the paint constantly, seeing if they can draw a foul, and in so doing get everybody on the bleachers to come down on the field and to start fighting. This is the plan. And Rutte, when he makes this, hypothetical, when he conjectures this, really the accusation is a confession. He's saying, he's leaking what NATO and the United States have planned against China, which is a multi-front hybrid war dispersed all along its periphery.
And again, this to me is just so nonsensical that there are a couple of other elements I wanted to highlight. One, he references the autonomous nation of Taiwan. Whatever happened to the one China policy? That seems to have now just been disregarded, with no real official statement by the State Department that the one China policy is no longer the official China policy. And the other thing he says, and if you get a chance to read this, all of this comes out of an interview that he did with the New York Times. He says Trump put in place an excellent foreign policy team, including Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and Matt Whitaker. And then he takes a shot at Secretary Lavrov. He says, I'm sure you saw comments by Lavrov. He says, I know Lavrov very well. He's been the foreign minister since the birth of Jesus Christ. I've never taken him seriously. When you talk about fake news, listen to Sergey Lavrov, one of the most polished and formidable diplomats you'd ever run up against.
Absolutely. I mean, he sets the standard for international diplomacy. So for Mark Rutte to be saying that, it's just kind of preposterous. As I said, the mushrooms are still working. He's still shrooming hard. He needs to come down from his trip and do some serious detox. But yeah, I mean, these are people who think that they can bend reality to their ideas, to their wishes. And I think that what they're doing, as is obvious, is they're manufacturing consent. And of course, in the case of Mark Rutte, he's doing some major rear end kissing. I mean,
Yeah.
this is like off the charts rear end kissing. I mean, when he says that, the best team that he's ever seen, I my words fail me. And
Lest we forget, Donald Trump is the one that conferred the moniker of Lil Marco to Marco Rubio. And now Lil Marco is supposed to be traversing the world as the spokesperson for American policy. And final point on this, and I, and you can give the exact references and terminology here. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, career diplomat. When Chinese students are interested in joining the Chinese diplomatic corps, they go to a university and they study diplomacy as a major. This is not just some political appointment that President Xi Jinping decides to give to one of his benefactors. There is a whole curriculum, years of study that these individuals go through so that they can then successfully engage in a lifetime of diplomacy. And so and then going on the Russian side, when you say Sergey Lavrov has been the foreign minister since the times of Jesus Christ, well, that means you might want to respect that man because he's seen a thing or two in his lifetime. Final point on that, KJ.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, fundamentally, what it underlines is that the Chinese diplomatic system and the political system of government itself is extraordinarily merit-based. It takes people at a young age. It gives them professional training. In the case of diplomats, they go to a school where they learn diplomacy, and then they're mentored up the ranks, and they're constantly tested. And it's only after years, decades of proving your mettle that you reach a certain level of prominence or influence, as opposed to the United States, as you point out, that like Ambassador Hormel, just the fact that you are the scion of the spam empire, and you gave a big donation, that makes you ambassador. I mean, this is the kind of absurdity that we live in. Same thing with, schools. You endow a building and then you get to go to your top Ivy League school. This is the fundamental corruption that is built into the U.S. system that is so normalized that we don't even think to challenge it. We don't think that this is actually a form of corruption, of bribery. And of course, the Chinese don't have that. If you're a diplomat, you worked your way up and you know what you're doing and you speak multiple languages. I don't know many US diplomats that speak multiple languages, but you look at the Chinese, they work all the aspects of diplomacy. And I think it's such a contrast, and it speaks to the larger picture of why we are circling the drain, both domestically, but also internationally in terms of international politics. We just see an end, it's just, we had Mike Pompeo, and I thought that was the gutter. And then we ended up with, Blinken, who I didn't think that could be worse than Pompeo, but he does diplomacy the way that he sings the blues, which is to say a rank amateur who should be, who should be laughed off stage. And now we have Secretary Rubio, of course, who is, again, somebody with no experience, absolutely no experience in diplomacy. In fact, the Chinese have sanctioned him. He can't, set foot in China to do any diplomatic engagement because he's being so off the charts with his mendacity and propaganda and hate mongering against China. So these are very, very dark times. When your diplomats are functioning at that level and the quote unquote top leaders of the rules-based international order can do nothing but suck up and insult the real, statesmen and diplomats, then we're in a very, very bad place.
Lee Ricks, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. Kevin Baptiste, thank you, and Kevin for his $10. And Kevin says, KJ, what are your thoughts on the recent meeting between Iran and North Korea?
I think it's very interesting, and I think we still have to wait for more developments. We have to see what comes out of it. I haven't seen any official readouts, but I think it's very interesting, and I think it fits in line with North Korea's long tradition of supporting the underdog. North Korea is the ultimate underdog, but they have never folded. They've always fought back. I have compared them to a maroon society. Society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting. Go ahead. That's an interesting analogy.
Well, I mean, as you know, maroon societies that we saw in Haiti, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and in, the south of the United States were created by slaves that had escaped plantations and then created highly disciplined, societies that were capable of defending themselves. And of course, they were very discreet, they kept a high level of secrecy, but they were incredibly disciplined, and they were not going to be, re-enslaved. And I think the North Koreans have functioned from that standpoint. We were colonized, we were genocided. People don't realize that there was a genocide of at least 1/5 of the population of North Korea during the 1950s. The U.S. turned that entire country, which is about 900 times the size of northern Gaza. They turned that entire country, made it look like Gaza. What we see in Gaza over that area, they did to the entire country. Nothing was left standing. The entire country looked like a moonscape. And North Koreans came back from that, and they decided that we are never, ever going to be subjugated. And they fought back, and they've prevailed. And they are poor, but they're probably the most advanced poor country in the world. In terms of GDP, one of the lowest, but in terms of life expectancy, they punch 100 rankings above their expected life expectancy. They're very extraordinary, in terms of their statecraft, diplomacy, and most importantly, in terms of their militant resistance. They've always supported liberation movements and resistance to the empire, and they put their money where their mouth is. So they've supported many liberation movements in Africa and in the Middle East, including the PLO, and of course, most recently they came and fought alongside the Russians in Kursk, inside Russia itself, because Russia and North Korea have a mutual defense treaty. So it does not surprise me that the North Koreans are extending their hand of support to Iran.
Two things. One, Donald Byrd, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. And just as a follow-up to the point about North Koreans fighting alongside the Russians in Kursk, when we first heard the reports of North Korean soldiers fighting alongside Russians, we dismissed that and said that that didn't make any sense. They were reporting that the individuals had security badges from a place called Tuna. I'm drawing a blank on the proper pronunciation of this area.
One of the ethnic minority regions of Russia.
Yes. And so the logic was, what was it, Occam's razor? The most logical explanation tends to be the best explanation. So if these people were carrying ID badges from this area, why don't we just assume they're from this area? And then months later, we find out, oh, there are North Koreans fighting alongside Russians. So was it that when the story was first reported, the story was wrong, and then the North Koreans later came in? Or, to your knowledge, was the story valid from the very beginning?
Wilma, I was one of the first people who criticized this, and it's rare that I take back what I said. But yes, the North Koreans were supporting the Russians in Kursk.
Okay.
But we have to remember that everything, almost everything we were told about that deployment of North Koreans to Russia was a lie. There were lies cloaked in lies, cloaked in lies, cloaked in lies. And there was a tiny, tiny kernel of truth, which was that the North Koreans had offered their services to the Russians and actually were in the battlefield first, I assume, as observers, trying to, learn new tactics and strategies. And then later, it turns out they were actual special forces, North Korean special forces, that had engaged in combat. The lies were that the North Koreans were fighting in Ukraine. They were not. The other lie was that these were conscripts that had been, just being told that they were going on a training mission. They didn't even know where they were, and they were being sent out by the droves, by the thousands, as cannon fodder to attract drone attacks. And then, they were supposed to blow themselves up, So there were just so many preposterous, exorbitant, extravagant lies that I think anybody who heard this, thinking critically, would have to assume that it was a lie. There was a tiny, tiny kernel of truth, which is far distant from what they asserted, which was that North Koreans did not go to Ukraine, but they were helping the Russians defend Kursk, which is Russian territory. But
Tuva is the name of the place.
Exactly.
And these people were Tuvans.
Correct.
And
they still may have been Tuvans.
They had Tuvan ID, so
they had Tuvan ID. So it's still probably very likely. The people that were captured, I'm still not convinced that they were actually North Koreans.
Gotcha.
Russia has many, many Asian minorities, and they serve in the military.
Lavrov and Rubio held bilateral meetings on the Asian, and that's the acronym for the group, not Asia, but ASEAN sidelines in Malaysia. And Rubio calls conversations with Lavrov very frank and important, as though from the American side, they're trying to present this as Marco Rubio held Sergey Lavrov or took him to task. KJ.
Yeah, it's a bit like it's a bit like me saying that I went into the ring with Muhammad Ali and took him to task. I think that Lavrov has the stature of really, an extraordinary diplomat, and I seriously doubt that Secretary Rubio was able to take Sergey Lavrov to the woodshed. That's just not something I can imagine happening. But what is important here is that Secretary Rubio is visiting ASEAN, and he's coming as really the harbinger of bad news, and he's trying to attenuate that bad news, and he's trying to offer a carrot. What do I mean by that? President Trump has released these new tariffs on the countries of the world, and he started with many of the Southeast Asian and Asian countries. And you can see there's a kind of hierarchy. President Trump said that he would, sign 90 deals in 90 days. Didn't happen. Only one deal and one commitment to a deal. So they're way off schedule. But now they started sending out these, what can be described as very, very childish letters, unilaterally notifying these countries that these tariffs are going to come, and then they're threats that are combined, and they go from 20% to 25% to 30 to 35, 40, and for Brazil, 50% because they're prosecuting Bolsonaro, which lets you know that this entire taxonomy and calculation around tariffs is purely political. In fact, if you look at them, there's absolutely no logic and there's no correlation to any trade balance or imbalance. Essentially, when you look at these tiers of tariffs, you can tell which countries are Washington vassals, which countries are being groomed to be Washington vassals, which countries are complete and total rear end licking vassals, like the Philippines. That's the lowest tier, 20%. Korea, Japan, Taiwan Island, 25%. Kazakhstan as well. And then you see the other countries, it goes up from there. But essentially, we see a kind of a taxonomy or a grading of the countries of Southeast Asia according to tariff, based on how accommodating or sycophantic they've been to the United States. I think the one exception to that is Vietnam, which they're trying to court. They're trying to pull out of the Chinese orbit because they've suddenly, decided, because China and Vietnam have been really strengthening their relations, and geographically Vietnam is important. But inside this taxonomy, I mean, this is an incredible threat to many of these countries. And the ASEAN response has been not to go down on their knees and beg for, better conditions. What they've done instead is they have prepared their statement, which essentially is called the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, FTA. So they're creating a free trade agreement so that all the ASEAN countries will trade freely with China. And this is, ASEAN is China's largest trade partner. It's 770 billion. And they're saying, we're just going to create a free trade zone amongst ourselves. And we're not going to really pay that much attention to Trump's tariffs. And so Marco Rubio is going to ASEAN, to Kuala Lumpur, and he's trying to cajole them and perhaps offer them some inducements or carrots, and probably some veiled threats as well, to see if he can peel them off from this ASEAN-China FTA and fall in line with the U.S. agenda. So,
and this also takes place on the heels of the BRICS meeting, the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, and Trump just unilaterally says, well, we're imposing tariffs on any countries that are engaging and cooperating with BRICS because they are anti-American and they're anti-dollar.
Well, I mean, they're anti-dollar to the extent that the U.S. has made the dollar so hard to use that it's weaponized it and used it as a tool to, sanction countries and to, make life difficult for them. So, I mean, that process is happening regardless. That would happen regardless of whether there was a BRICS bloc or not. But yes, BRICS is an anti-hegemonic coalition. It's a trading coalition, but it is the largest trading coalition in the world now in terms of, certainly population and landmass, and rapidly approaching that in terms of its finances. And Trump doesn't want that. He knows that the BRICS pose a threat to the U.S. conception of unipolar global hegemony. So he's threatening them and, saying that he's going to raise, tariffs enormously if they do that, or if they de-dollarize. At least he has the sense to understand that de-dollarization is one of the key issues at stake. But everything that he's doing is driving this, is making it more and more likely that countries will de-dollarize, and more likely that BRICS or other anti-hegemonic coalitions will strengthen and increase, because he is literally driving them away. The US, as a business strategy, is simply shorting the entire planet. China is going long. They're looking for investments. They're expecting things to get better. And the US plan is to short everything, to threaten everything, to threaten to kneecap everybody, and thinking that is a valid diplomatic strategy for strengthening its standing in, in the League of Nations. It's not going to happen. It's also a preparation for war. We have to understand this tariff war is actually a continuation through other means of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the economic arm of the U.S. Escalation to war against China. There was the air-sea battle, which was the military doctrine. It was the plan of war, which was derived from Israeli war doctrine, from the Yom Kippur War. Essentially, we're going to, decapitate the Chinese leadership. And then the economic arm of this war or warfare against China was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was the idea that they would isolate China and just have the Pacific nations trade amongst themselves while excluding China from, this large bloc. Well, Trump abandoned that, and he decided to go full frontal simply with tariffs. And now that he's recalibrating that and trying to use tariffs once again to force countries to isolate China and detach themselves from China. But it's not working because there's such a mercantile thinking and a greed and a desire for profits and for the tariff revenue that he can't get his strategy straight. And of course, it's also important to notice that trade in general, as as an uncoerced relationship, is actually a common good. Countries win from both parties win when you trade. Wilmer, if I run a restaurant and you come in and I give you food and you pay me, it's win-win for both of us, right? I make money and you get hopefully a satisfying nourishment, right? It's both win-win. And it would be insane for me to complain to you that, Wilmer, it would be insane if you said, well, KJ, the restaurant owner, never buys anything from me, therefore he's ripping me off, and I need to sanction him. When actually, I have been just receiving IOUs from you for 20 years because the U.S. has been printing money. So it's such a misapprehension of global affairs and of the trade system. And now it's being weaponized and used as a coercive tool. And it's going to create such a huge mess. In fact, it already is.
Going back tangentially to Ruta's comments, the Department of the Air Force kicked off department-level exercises in the Pacific on Monday along the same lines as Taiwan's annual military exercise, Han Quang. And so talk about what this is demonstrating. These department level exercises, they're scheduled to feature 12,000 U.S. Air and Space Force personnel, more than 350 bomber, fighter, cargo, and refueling aircraft, and space-based and space-enabled capabilities as well, again, along the same time as Taiwan's annual military exercise, Han Quang. And the United States, I believe, is also sending higher level missiles into Taiwan as well.
Yes, they're sending HIMARS, which can actually hit, about 20 different cities on the Chinese coast from Taiwan Island. So it's incredible escalation, incredibly provocative. But they've already sold them, maybe 16 HIMARS. There are more in the works, and they're preparing for this kind of shoot and scoot asymmetrical warfare to provoke China. Going back to our original statement, this notion that Taiwan is autonomous is an absurdity in its face. It is essentially a family quarrel between the KMT, or the remnants of the KMT, that ran away after they lost the Civil War, and they created a rump state, a little bit like, after the Civil War, the Confederacy went to Galveston Island and they tried to regroup. And, from that stand, essentially, eventually they surrendered and, the war was ended. But if you can imagine, the Chinese had intervened as the Union troops had tried to retake Galveston Island and said that, these Confederate troops on Galveston Island represent the whole of the United States, and they're the, rightful, leaders of the U.S., you would be laughed out of the country. But this is what the U.S. did. It applied force, and then it turned Taiwan into a weapons platform. So if you look at China-U.S. relations, they've gone through 4 stages. They've gone through war. That was 1949 until the 1970s, both hot war and cold war, the Korean War and dirty war waged through Myanmar and Tibet and everywhere else. The second stage after war was détente, which was the Nixon-Kissinger era. And then the third stage was essentially regime change or absorption. This is the WTO era from the 1990s, the Clinton era, the panda hugging era until about 2008. That was the era of engagement, but also absorption or attempted regime change. And then from the fourth phase is we have come full cycle and we're back at war with China. And that war was planned starting around 2009. Literally, we have the war doctrine that was spelled out, air-sea battle, started in 2009. And then we had the pivot to Asia declared and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been a continuous, ongoing, escalating process of war. But as you mark these 4 stages, war, détente, absorption, or regime change, and war, you can notice at each stage the role that Taiwan played. First, the U.S. used Taiwan as a weapons platform, a forward base. It was, as they referred to it, literally an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And the U.S. placed, nuclear weapons on Taiwan Island entirely during that period. When Nixon normalized relations with China, Taiwan went from being a weapon against China into becoming a hedge against China. And they also used Taiwan Island as a kind of annex or a subcontractor to do the US's dirty work, the work that was so dirty that even the CIA couldn't touch it directly. They would have Taiwan Island do that. So, for example, they trained death squads on Taiwan Island. This is the Peitu Political Warfare Cadres Academy. Roberto D'Orbison, the death squad monster of El Salvador, was trained in Taiwan Island. They say we went there. What did we learn? We learned unbridled cruelty. So all the kind of dirty tricks, the dirty wars, and the kind of dirty alliances were quietly subcontracted to Taiwan Island as this kind of imperial lackey that did really the kind of janitorial work that was unspeakable. That's why Taiwan had such close relations with Israel and South Africa and the other dictatorships such as South Korea and the Philippines. And they also were a kind of a clearinghouse for global fascism. So the Ukrainian Nazis, the Eastern European Nazis, they all had their kind of home base run out of Taiwan and the World Anti-Communist League. And also the Iran-Contra scandal was run out of, Taiwan's World Anti-Communist League. So again, the long history of dirty wars and dirty tricks, dirty operations. Air America was actually a civil air transport, which was Taiwan's national, international flight carrier. The U.S. had Air America, which it used, for dirty wars and for drug smuggling. But the front for Air America was civil air transport, which was the Taiwan's national carrier. And so this gives you a sense of how deeply it was involved in, kind of the U.S. As a U.S. Quisling doing dirty tasks for the U.S. But anyway, during that period, Taiwan went from being a weapon to being kind of this underhanded butler. And then it became, during the opening and engagement period, it became a hedge. But the US never let go of it, even as it said, signed the, 3 communiques and said that we recognize only China and Taiwan is a
Mm-hmm.
province of China. They were still kind of, feeding it weapons and pumping it up and using it as this ideological base or an ideological hedge against China. And then after 2008, 2009, and more specifically starting with the Obama administration, Taiwan has overtly reverted back to being a US base. There are currently at least 500 US special forces on Taiwan Island. They're on Jinmen Island of the archipelago, which means that they're within swimming distance of the Chinese mainland. You could do a lazy backstroke and still reach the Chinese mainland from Jinmen Island. And the US essentially has planted themselves all inside the ROC Taiwan military, and they're micro-auditing and micromanaging it. So they're seriously turning it into the next Ukraine. And the DPP, the US Quisling government of the DPP, which actually has a former US citizen as its vice president, a Jersey girl by the name of Louise Hsiao. She is actually the vice president. She's the kind of the neocon darling, and she's the minder for the figurehead president. And they're all escalating and pushing this towards war. They're the next Ukraine. William Lai is the Zelensky, and Louise Hsiao is the kind of underhanded. She's like the native Victoria Nuland, who's winding the wind up toy. But all of this is to say that we're getting very, very close to war in the Pacific, and this exercise that the US is doing is just more proof. These are department level exercises which have not been done in over 30 years. We're talking, when we say a department level exercise, it means the entire department of the military, the entire Air Force, or in this case, the Air Force with the Space Force, all of them are rehearsing for war together. We're talking about rehearsal for total war. If you look, if you know anything about military exercise, there are about 20 different types of military exercise, field training exercises, and command post exercises, deployment exercises, etc. This covers all of them. It's everything plus, and essentially it's a rehearsal for total war. 350 planes that are rehearsing interoperable strikes and missions, along with the Space Force itself. And of course, as you point out, this dovetails with what is happening right now on Taiwan Island, which is the Hanguang exercise, where they're using these new American HIMARS. They're also using new American tanks, and they're essentially rehearsing for war. This is the provocation. This is the rehearsal. This is the staging of the theater for war.
Pauline Douglas, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. And I want to try to quickly tie two things together. One, again, going back to Ruta's comments about Russia, about China planning to invade Taiwan. He's really projecting onto China what the West is trying to do to China. But at the same time, you go back to 2024, I believe it was, there were joint exercises being conducted between the Chinese and the Russian navies around Alaska and the Bering Strait, Bering Sea. So that was last year. So it seems as though we've been on this very slow trajectory, but trajectory nonetheless to where we are now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the US has been building a large, vast panoply of alliances, war alliances against China. We're talking about JACAS, Japan, Korea, U.S. alliance, which for Koreans, I'm a Korean, is unthinkable. It is really unthinkable that Japan and Korea, Japan is the former colonizer of Korea, would actually be in some kind of military alliance together. The thought that the rising sun would be seen on the Korean peninsula or in Korean waters is unthinkable to most Koreans. But there's JACAS, there's JAFAS, Japan, Philippines, and U.S. alliance. There's AUKUS, there's Australia, UK, and U.S. alliance. There was also supposed to be the Quad, but India has been on again, off again around that. And then NATO has been trying to set up a kind of East Asian NATO. So they're already setting up offices, and they're trying to get in on the action. So as you said very correctly, it is projection. It's what NATO is planning for China in terms of waging war against it. What they're accusing China is what they're actually planning for. The accusation is a confession. And of course, it is not a surprise then that China would be rehearsing counter actions against this. So they've been rehearsing with Russia, working on interoperability in various areas. And they've also been, supporting other countries in their interoperability and their capacity to resist the United States. That said, the Chinese don't want war. They have one base. They have one base in Djibouti, outside of China. The U.S. has 900 bases. It has somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 bases encircling China. And that's only the ones that they will name. Most of the bases are, incognito, or they're lily pads or basing agreements. But the U.S. has encircled China, with dragon's teeth. They're spoiling for war. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians understand, and the Iranians understand, that unless they stick together, they will be taken apart and hanged separately. It's like when you play the game of Go, you put your stones down on the board. If you have a single stone, it can be surrounded and taken off the board. But if you link those stones together, then that becomes essentially inviolable territory. They're trying to build strong alliances that prevent this.
And we're up against the clock, so thank you very much, KJ, to a number of you that asked some very good questions. Let me just, Fei Lu, U.S. Navy, she's a Navy vet. There's nothing. Oh, that's not what I wanted. That's not the one I wanted. There was another comment by her. Let me see if I can quickly find it. But Suzenko mentioned the North Korean and Iranian delegation meeting at the North Korean embassy, and announcing that they'd get involved when Israel breaks the ceasefire. I had not read that part of it, but you are nodding in affirmation that is in fact what one of the outcomes of the meeting.
As I said, I haven't seen the readouts yet.
Right.
So
neither had I.
There's a bit of speculation going on, but I don't think it's out of the question. The North Koreans have a long history of supporting, national liberation movements and defense movements, and certainly the Palestinians. They are, if anything, they have been, principled actors in the Global South, supporting Global South liberation movements.
KJ, no, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it. As always, look forward to having you back. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, KJ. And folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episodes next week. Monday, we will be joined by Dan Kovalik. Professor Dan Kovalik is going to join us. We're going to talk about what's going on in Palestine. We're going to talk about the broader implications of the New York mayoral race as it relates to Democratic Party politics across the country. And we're going to be talking about the latest brutality that's being demonstrated in Syria. So there's an awful lot to talk about with Professor Dan Kovalik on Monday. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Y'all have a great, blessed, safe weekend. See y'all on Monday. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.